Hi, I'm Mr. Murray, and welcome to the audio lecture notes of Theater Construction History Part 1. Today we'll take a look at the history of performance spaces. This will not focus on the influential playwrights or their characters and themes, but rather the theatrical spaces themselves. As we go through this timeline, I want you to ask yourself one key question. What influenced the change in performance venues over time? As you can see, we're about to blast through 2,000 years of history. The theater not only reflects the world around it at the time, but there's also a strong sense of tradition in the theater. You'll see most of the conventions of our modern stage got their start hundreds of years ago. Though there were certainly performances of stories with costumes, song, poetry, and dance before Greek city-states, the earliest roots of theater as we know it come from the hills around Athens. The Greek theestai, to behold, is applied to a location which shows were performed called a beholding place or theatron. To behold is a great translation, because this applies both to sight and sound. Of course, this is where we get our word theater. Though some of the earliest theaters known to history still survive as stone ruins, some of these curved slopes originally were fitted with wooden benches. Now either the benches grew too old, or the plays too popular, but contemporary reports indicated that the benches collapsed and later were replaced with stone. These semicircular spaces were built around a flat circular orchestra and were capped at one end by a building called a skene. The skene served as a place for actors to adorn their costume and enter into the middle of the performance area. When the character left the orchestra, the actor could then hide from the audience view in the skene and change masks and robes into a new character, furthering the action. Later stages then divided the skene and orchestra with a raised platform called a proskenion, meaning before the skene. This is where we get both the words scene and also proscenium, as in the proscenium arch. Remember that? It will pop up later. All of these early theaters used partially excavated natural hillsides to build benches that could house thousands of spectators. The locations of theaters and the timing of performances were often closely tied to the hilltop temples and various religious festivals. The audience not only had a clear view of the performers, but in many cases a wide view of the hills and valleys in the distance behind the skene. We don't have surviving examples of the wooden structures that ancient Greek performers used to enhance the shows, but we do have detailed descriptions from a later author in Rome called Vitruvius. He describes three main devices as periaktoi, which could rotate to display one of three painted scenes, ekekleima, which could roll on and off stage with actors or scenery, and a machine for flying either effigies of gods or living performers. This god from the machine survives in the Latin term deus ex machina. Speaking of Vitruvius, the Romans took inspiration from the Greek theaters, but improvements in masonry allowed for theaters to come down off the hillsides and be built right in the middle of Roman cities. The altars moved away from the central playing space up into the ever higher tiers of seating. The skene also grew in height and came to dominate the view of the audience seated within a completely walled-off space. This larger building, now called the Franz Scene, had a decorated facade adorned with carvings and statues, both religious and civic in nature. This made up a permanent artificial scene for any performance, but there is a strong indication that painted temporary scenery was used for each of the three types of performances: stately temple-like views for tragedy, urban scenes for comedy, and views of nature for satires. After the fall of Rome, the through line of Western theater was essentially halted. Storytelling, music, and dancing still continued, but on a much smaller scale, and dramatic entertainment wouldn't see the same kind of popular attention for hundreds of years. Theatrical performances, that is to say, stories where performers embodied characters in the drama and sung or spoke dialogue, came back to Europe in the form of liturgical dramas, where performers would enact biblical scenes during the Mass in cathedrals. These small performances became popular enough to build into entire pageants on their own, with specially constructed scenery surrounding the central pews. The audience would progress around the aisles from scene to scene, with heaven near the altar and hell opposite. The ever-increasing popularity took these morality plays out of the cathedrals and into the streets and fields. Two variations arose. Either the audience would progress past the various scenes, or the scenes would progress past the audience. These wheeled platform stages are called pageant wagons, and they were pulled by horses or cattle as the show continued, much like a modern parade float. Though these performances took place outside the churches, they were directly orchestrated and funded by the church, and even plays not based on biblical text still included the mansions of heaven and the spectacular hellmouth. Unlike the Greek and Roman theatrical spaces, there's not much physical evidence left behind in the playing spaces outside medieval cathedrals, but the written record suggests their popularity grew annually. Bishops even offered indulgences, that is to say, incentives in the afterlife, for those parishioners who attended the plays. There will be a hard turn ahead for theatrical tradition. Remember the question from the beginning? What influenced a change in performance venues? I would say that question has two branches. Firstly, what technology allowed for a change in performances? And secondly, how did performance spaces change as a result of religious and political change? As trade opened to Europe and other parts of the world, ideas opened European minds to their own past. The texts of Roman plays were preserved in Asia and Africa, and wealthy merchants in Italy became keen on identifying themselves with their ancient ancestors. Private theatricals became even more ornate, with scenery that improved on ancient ideas of geometry, creating perspective scenes. These wealthy merchants either showed the glory of their family or pooled resources for their city to construct the idea of a Roman theater. But now, these large wooden-framed structures had roofs, and the heavy stone statues could be made of lightweight plaster and papier-mâché. The illusion permeated the physical space, with a slightly tilted or raked stage to allow the false horizon of the scenery behind the arches of the facade, now called a proscenium arch. Meanwhile, across Europe, the less wealthy Spanish merchants supported performances of Roman-inspired works in the courtyards of their homes and businesses. These corrals became the model of a new theatrical space, with the audience stacked in balconies and the stage butting up against one end of the rectangular open-air courtyards. In England, the actors had to compete with other popular entertainments, such as bear baiting. These round arenas were closer in shape to wooden coliseums, and acting companies adapted them with square stages thrusting out into the pit at the center of the ring, with a back wall reserved to serve the same function as the old skene before. As England grew in political power and economic might, the private entertainments of the royal court adapted Italian spectacles. The scenery, however, was no longer static, but constantly moving from scene to scene with fantastic and elaborate stage pictures made with wooden scenery and illuminated with specially devised hanging lamps for brilliant illumination even at night. European theater continued onward, with other new inventions such as cast iron construction, mechanical lifts and rigging, lighting with natural gas, electricity, and so on. But let's pump the brakes and remember that the non-European world had its own exciting and varied theatrical traditions, similarly shaped by technology, religion, and politics. The most important thing to know about Japanese theatrical tradition is that not only do the plays survive from the 15th and 16th century, but much of the material culture survives from that time, including the costumes and theatrical spaces. The No and Kyogen traditions form together, with No stages carefully maintained in temples, and Kyogen stages thrown together for festivals in towns. Though the Sanskrit dramas of India don't enjoy such a strong through line as Japanese performance, much like the Italian merchants reviving Roman plays, modern Indian artists are bringing Kudiyattam theater back to public attention. A completely different kind of theatrical space survives in Turkey. The shadow puppet theater is portable and can be set up in private homes, coffee shops, and street corners. And if you're wondering how the names are pronounced, it's something akin to Karagos and Hachivat. Most works of theater history summarize the contribution of solely European artists, and lump the rest of the world into other. As the global economy continues to shift and new technology allows for greater interconnectivity, various histories are reaching a far wider audience. I would love to expand the summary of global theater history to include other parts of the world.